At 70 years old, most people settle into the quiet rhythms of retirement, content with gentle routines and peaceful afternoons. But Margaret Wilson's life was about to take an extraordinary turn. In a sunlit doctor's office in Chicago, she received news that would shatter anyone's world. Terminal pancreatic cancer, 6 months to live. For most, this would be the end of the story, a time to quietly settle affairs and say goodbye. But Margaret wasn't most people. Instead of surrendering to fate, she pulled out a dusty journal filled with decades of unfulfilled dreams, unspoken apologies, and roads not taken. What happened next would leave her doctors stunned, her family amazed, and eventually inspire thousands. This isn't a story about dying. It's about a remarkable woman who decided that life isn't measured in time, but in the courage to finally live without fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through lace curtains Margaret had hung 30 years ago, casting familiar shadows across her pristine living room. Everything had its place here. The china figurines her late husband Robert had collected, arranged by height on glass shelves, the precisely fluffed cushions on her beige sofa, the carefully dusted family photos showing younger versions of herself with increasingly graying hair. She followed her daily routine with practiced precision. Coffee at 7, precisely 2 slices of whole wheat toast, the morning paper that still arrived at her doorstep despite Emma's insistence that digital subscriptions were more practical. "Mom, it's 2025, her daughter would say during their weekly Sunday calls, her voice carrying that familiar mix of love and exasperation. Everything's digital now, but Margaret found comfort in the tangible, the rustle of paper, the weight of her ceramic coffee mug, the ticking of the grandfather clock that had been Robert's pride and joy. After 43 years of marriage, 5 years of widowhood, and 70 years of playing it safe, she had mastered the art of comfortable predictability. From her favorite armchair, she could see the easel in the corner of her sunroom, draped with an old sheet. She hadn't touched it since Robert's passing. But sometimes, in moments like these, she remembered the young woman who had once dreamed of filling galleries with her work. The acceptance letter from the Art Institute of Chicago still lay buried in a box somewhere in her attic, yellowed with age and regret. Robert had been practical about it. Art wasn't a stable career, and they had wanted to start a family. She had agreed, setting aside her brushes for a sensible job in office administration. The sound of a text message interrupted her thoughts. Emma, checking in as she did every morning between court cases. Her daughter had inherited Robert's pragmatism, channeling it into a successful career as a corporate lawyer. The message was brief. "Tommy's art show is next week. He asked about you." Margaret's heart tightened. Her 14-year-old grandson had grown increasingly distant over the past year, preferring video games and his phone to afternoons with his grandmother. She hadn't known about the art show. When had he started making art? Had he inherited her buried passion? She typed back a careful response. "I'll be there," knowing Emma would be surprised. These days, Margaret rarely left her neighborhood, content with her routine of book club meetings and occasional bridge games with other widows from church. The morning light shifted, catching the dust motes dancing around her husband's antique collection. Robert had been a good man, solid and dependable. They'd had a comfortable life, raised a successful daughter, saved for retirement. By all conventional measures, she had lived well. Yet lately, she'd been waking with a heaviness in her chest that had nothing to do with the persistent cough she'd been ignoring. Dreams had started haunting her, dreams of bright canvases and bold colors, of the sister she hadn't spoken to in 20 years, of roads not taken and words left unsaid. The grandfather clock struck 9, and Margaret rose to begin her daily tidying. As she picked up her coffee cup, a wave of dizziness struck her. She steadied herself against the counter, trying to ignore the growing frequency of these spells. The doctor's appointment later that day was just a precaution, she told herself. Just another routine checkup in her carefully ordered life. But deep down, in a place she rarely acknowledged, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she had confused living well with living safely. The pristine house, the predictable routines, the carefully maintained appearance of contentment. Had she spent so long preparing for life that she'd forgotten to actually live it? She glanced again at the shrouded easel. For a moment, her fingers itched to pull away the sheet, to see if any of her old brushes were still usable. Instead, she straightened a figurine that didn't need straightening and checked her watch. Time to get ready for the doctor. There would be time for such thoughts later. There was always later. The attic had always been Robert's domain. Even now, 5 years after his passing, Margaret felt like an intruder as she climbed the narrow stairs, steadying herself against the wall. The morning's doctor's appointment loomed ahead, but something had drawn her up here, perhaps the same restlessness that had been haunting her dreams. Dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight, making her cough. She ignored the familiar tightness in her chest, moving deeper into the cramped space. Robert had labeled everything meticulously. Christmas decorations 1980-1995, tax returns 1975-1985, Margaret's art supplies. Her hand trembled as she reached for that last box. Inside, beneath brittle newspapers announcing events long forgotten, lay her leather-bound journal. The pages crackled as she opened it, releasing the scent of youth and possibility. Her own handwriting, bolder then, stared back at her. Dreams for Life, 1971. Study at the Art Institute of Chicago. Paint the sunset in Paris. Reconcile with Claire. Open my own gallery, travel across America with just a sketchbook. The list went on. Each entry a road not taken. She remembered writing it, sitting cross-legged on her childhood bed while Claire played folk music next door. Her sister had been the wild one, always encouraging Margaret to break free. Life's too short for maybes, Claire used to say. A photograph slipped from between the pages, two young women with matching dark hair and bright smiles, arms around each other at some forgotten beach. On the back, in Claire's messy scrawl, Sisters Forever, Summer 71. Less than a year before the fight that would tear them apart. It had started over their parents' will, but grew into something uglier. Accusations of betrayal, of stealing their father's affection, of always playing it safe, while Claire took all the risks. The last time they'd spoken, Claire was heading to Oregon to open an art commune. "At least one of us is living," she'd said, words that had stung for decades. Margaret sank onto an old trunk, journal clutched to her chest. More memories surfaced. The day she'd received her acceptance letter from the Art Institute, full scholarship. Robert, then just her boyfriend, had taken her to dinner to celebrate. But somehow by dessert, they were discussing practical alternatives. He'd helped her draft the letter declining the scholarship. She'd thought she was being mature, responsible. The job at Wilson and Associates had benefits, stability. Art school meant uncertainty, meant becoming like Claire, untethered, searching. She'd chosen security, telling herself there would be time for art later, always later. Her fingers traced another entry. Paint something that scares me. She'd been so bold then, so full of plans. When had safety become more important than dreams? When had she started measuring her life in risks avoided rather than chances taken? A series of sketches filled the next pages, quick studies of people on buses, in parks, living their lives. The last drawing was dated September 1971, a self-portrait, her younger self staring out with eyes full of possibility. She'd captured something there, some vital spark that she now struggled to recognize in her mirror. The college acceptance letter was there too, along with a newspaper clipping about a student art show she'd won. "Local girls shows promise," the headline declared. Promise. Such a weighted word. It implied a future that should have unfolded differently. Her hand brushed against something else in the box, her old travel watercolor set, a graduation gift. From Claire, The paints had dried up decades ago, but the brushes were still wrapped in their original cloth, never used. She'd been saving them for the perfect moment, the right time to start her artistic journey. Now they lay stiff and forgotten, like dreams deferred too long. More coughing seized her, and this time she couldn't ignore the flecks of red on her handkerchief. The doctor's appointment. She should be getting ready, not sitting here with ghosts of old dreams. But the journal in her hands felt more urgent somehow, more vital than the persistent pain in her side that she'd been ignoring for months. A small notebook fell from the journal's back pocket, her idea book, where she'd sketched. Thumbnails for paintings never created. The Sister series, read one page, with rough sketches of Claire in various poses. Another showed plans for a cross-country painting journey, with notes about light conditions in different states and lists of must-see landscapes. She'd researched it all, planned it all, but never taken the first step. The attic suddenly felt too small, too cluttered with the debris of a life lived in waiting. Margaret stood, tucking the journal under her arm. She wasn't sure why, but she needed it with her at the doctor's office. Something about these recovered dreams felt important, like a message from her younger self, a reminder of who she was before she learned to choose safety over passion. As she descended the attic stairs, another coughing fit struck. This time, she had to sit on the steps until it passed, the journal pressed against her heart like a shield, or perhaps like a key, unlocking something she'd kept buried for far too long. The doctor's office awaited. But for the first time in years, Margaret felt something stirring beneath her carefully ordered existence, something that felt surprisingly like hope. Dr. Harrison's office felt colder than Margaret remembered from her routine visits. The journal sat heavy in her lap as she waited, its presence somehow both comforting and accusatory. On the wall, between framed medical certificates, a generic landscape print hung slightly crooked. Her fingers itched to straighten it, or better yet, replace it with something that actually spoke to the soul. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The words fell like stones in the quiet room. Given the advancement and your age, we're looking at roughly 6 months, Mrs. Wilson. With aggressive chemotherapy, we might extend that to... What would those months look like? Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. She'd expected to feel afraid, but instead she felt oddly clear-headed. Dr. Harrison blinked, adjusting his glasses. Well, with treatment, you'd need to come in 3 times a week. There would be side effects, nausea, fatigue, hair loss, but it could give you more time with your family. Family. Emma would insist on the treatment, of course. Her daughter approached everything like a legal case, problems to be fought, battles to be won. But as Dr. Harrison detailed the treatment plan, Margaret's hand strayed to her journal, fingers tracing the worn leather. And without treatment, she asked, Mrs. Wilson, I really think we should discuss this with your daughter present. Perhaps we could call her without treatment, Margaret pressed, her voice firmer now. The doctor sighed, removing his glasses. You'd have more energy initially, fewer side effects, but the disease would progress faster. Pain management would become essential. Hospice care. Thank you, Margaret said, standing up. I'll need some time to think about my options. But she had already decided, sitting there beneath the crooked landscape print. The journal's weight against her chest felt like permission, like her younger self reaching across decades to whisper, finally. Outside, Chicago's spring air hit her face, carrying the promise of renewal. She walked 3 blocks before finding a small coffee shop, its walls lined with local artwork. Settling into a corner table, she opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write, My living list, find Claire, show my art in a gallery, take Tommy on an adventure, paint every sunset for a month, tell the truth about everything. Her phone buzzed. Emma, probably checking on the appointment's outcome. Margaret silenced it, continuing her list. For the first time in decades, her hand moved with certainty. Each word a declaration of intent rather than a distant dream. The decision, crystallized as she wrote. No chemotherapy, no hospitals, no spending her final months fighting a losing battle in sterile rooms. Instead, she would spend them truly living, creating, making amends. She would die with paint on her hands, not needle marks in her arms. When she finally called Emma that evening, her daughter's reaction was exactly as expected. "Mom, you're not thinking clearly." Emma's lawyer voice was in full force. "We need to schedule the first treatment immediately. I'll clear my calendar. Take some time off." "I've thought about this more clearly than anything in my life," Margaret interrupted. "And I'm selling the house." The silence on the other end was deafening. "You what? Mom, you're sick. You need to be practical right now. I've been practical for 70 years, Emma. Look where it's got me." Margaret's voice softened. "I'm dying, sweetheart. That's not up for debate. What's up for debate is how I live before I do." "This is ridiculous. You need treatment, not some midlife crisis." "End-of-life crisis, actually," Margaret said, surprising herself with a small laugh. "And what I need is to stop waiting for someday." She could hear Emma pacing, could picture her daughter in her sleek downtown office, running her hands through her hair, the way she did when a case wasn't going her way. "What about Tommy? Have you thought about him?" "I have. That's why I'm doing this. I want him to remember a grandmother who lived, not one who just faded away in a hospital bed." After the call ended, Margaret sat in her pristine living room, looking at everything she'd arranged so carefully over the decades. The china figurines that had always been more Robert's passion than hers. The sensible furniture chosen for durability rather than beauty. The safe, inoffensive art on the walls. Her hands steady, she reached for her laptop, another of Emma's insisted upon modernizations, and opened a real estate website. Then she created a new email draft. "Dear Claire, it's been 20 years, and I owe you an apology. Several, actually. I'm coming to Oregon, and this time I won't be playing it safe." In the corner, the sheet-draped easel stood like a ghost of possibilities. Margaret stood, walked over, and yanked the sheet off in one motion. Dust swirled in the fading daylight, making her cough, but she didn't cover her mouth this time. Instead, she let herself feel everything. The pain in her side, the fear, the excitement, the grief, the wild, unexpected joy of finally choosing to be brave. She had 6 months to live. But first, she had 6 months to truly live, and she knew exactly where to start. The RV dealership salesman clearly didn't know what to make of Margaret. She could read it in his forced smile, the way he kept glancing at her sensible beige cardigan and perfectly styled grey hair. He'd already tried steering her toward Tiny. "In campervans 3 times. I said I want that one." Margaret pointed again at the 32-foot motorhome, gleaming in the morning sun. It was cream-colored with bold stripes of burgundy and gold. Exactly the kind of thing the old Margaret would have called ostentatious. "Ma'am, that's quite a powerful vehicle. Perhaps something more manageable?" "Young man," Margaret fixed. Him with the look she'd perfected over decades of dealing with patronizing bank managers. "I've managed a 3-story Victorian home for 40 years. I think I can handle an RV." 3 hours later, she sat behind the wheel of her new home, gripping it with trembling hands. The salesman had finally relented, though he'd insisted on having someone drive it to her house for her. Now, parked in her driveway, it looked absolutely absurd next to her prim flower beds and carefully trimmed hedges. "Mom, you've lost your..." Her mind. Emma stood on the front lawn, staring at the RV in horror. "You can't drive this thing. You won't drive this thing." "Actually," Margaret turned the key, and the engine rumbled to life. "I start lessons tomorrow." Her first driving lesson was a disaster. She clipped 2 traffic cones and nearly had a panic attack trying to back into a parking space. The instructor, a retired trucker named Joe, just chuckled. "Took me 3 weeks to learn to back up properly," he said, his weathered face kind. "But you've got good instincts. Just need to trust yourself more. Trust yourself." When was the last time she'd done that? Margaret returned every morning for the next week, ignoring Emma's increasingly frantic phone calls about treatment options and elder law specialists. It was during her fourth lesson that she heard the skateboard wheels. Tommy rolled to a stop. Beside the RV, his blue hair, when had that happened, bright against the morning sky. "This is seriously yours, Grandma?" His voice carried that familiar teenage mix of skepticism and reluctant interest. "Want to come see inside?" She watched her grandson try to maintain his cool indifference as she showed him the mini kitchen, the convertible bed, the small bathroom. But when she mentioned her plans to paint landscapes across the country, his eyes lit up. "You paint? Since when? Since before your mother was born?" Margaret hesitated, then added, "I used to dream of being an artist." "Used to?" The question, so simple from his young lips, hit her like a physical force. Used to, as if art was something you could stop being just because you stopped doing it. "Not used to," she corrected, straightening her shoulders. "I am an artist. I just forgot for a while." Tommy ran his hand along the RV's cushioned seats. "This is kind of cool, actually. Mom's freaking out about it." "Your mother freaks out about anything she can't control." The words slipped out before she could stop them, but Tommy's answering grin made her glad for the moment of honesty. "She said you're sick," he said suddenly, not meeting her eyes. "Like, really sick." Margaret sat down at the small dining table, patting the seat beside her. After a moment's hesitation, Tommy joined her. "I am," she said simply, "but that's exactly why I need to do this. I spent too long being afraid to live, Tommy. I don't want you to make the same mistake." "Is that why? You never painted because you were afraid?" Out of the mouths of babes. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, but forced them back. "Yes, and because I thought there would always be more time." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, scuffing his shoes against the RV's carpeted floor. "Could you teach me? Before you... while you're still..." "Yes," Margaret said quickly, her heart swelling. "Yes, I can teach you, though I might need some practice first. It's been a while." Later that evening, after Tommy had gone home, and she'd managed to successfully park the RV without any casualties, Margaret sat in her new vehicle, breathing in the smell of possibility. On the small table lay her journal, open to her living list. Beside "Take Tommy on an Adventure," she drew a small star. A beginning. Her phone buzzed. Emma again, probably with more doctor's recommendations or legal threats. But for the first time in her life, Margaret felt the freedom of choosing not to answer. Instead, she pulled out her old sketchbook and began to draw the sunset as it painted her driveway in shades of gold and promise. The Chicago Art Center's studio smelled of linseed oil and possibility. Margaret stood in the doorway, clutching her newly purchased art supplies, feeling every one of her 70 years. The other students were already setting up their easels, all of them young enough to be her grandchildren, their hair various shades of purple and green, their clothes splattered with paint in a way that seemed intentional rather than messy. "You must be Margaret." A woman with silver-streaked dreadlocks approached, her smile genuine. "I'm Maya. Welcome to Advanced Contemporary Techniques." "I think there's been a mistake," Margaret stammered. "I signed up for beginners." "No mistake. I saw your portfolio." Margaret's heart stopped. "My what?" "Your grandson brought in your old sketchbook, said you needed the advanced class." Maya's eyes twinkled. "Tommy's in my youth program. Talented kid. Now I see where he gets it." Heat rose to Margaret's cheeks as she remembered the sketchbook Tommy had borrowed from the RV. She'd assumed he was just curious. Instead, he'd taken matters into his own hands. The first assignment was a self-portrait, but with a twist. "Paint yourself as you truly are," Maya instructed. "Not your surface, but your essence." Margaret stared at the blank canvas, aware of the curious glances from her classmates. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up a brush, not from age or illness, but from the sheer weight of 50 years of untouched dreams. The pain in her side was acting up, but she ignored it. Instead, She closed her eyes, remembering the girl who'd once dreamed of Paris sunsets and gallery openings. When she opened them, her hand moved with surprising certainty. She painted herself split in two. On one side, the careful, controlled woman she'd become, rendered in muted beiges and greys. On the other, emerging from beneath like a butterfly. From a chrysalis, riots of colour and bold brush strokes. All the art she'd never made, all the lives she'd never lived bursting forth. And in the centre where the two halves met, she painted the cancer, not as a dark mass, but as a spark of light, the wake-up call she'd needed. "Holy shit," whispered a young man with a nose ring peering over her shoulder. "That's intense." By the end of class, a small crowd had gathered around her easel. Maya stood silent for a long moment, studying the painting. "This," she said finally, "is what raw truth looks like." A girl with pink hair and tattoos asked if she could take a photo for her art Instagram. Before Margaret could respond, her painting was being shared online, tagged with things like "Jar aging artist," "Jar on new beginnings," "Jar last chapter." That evening, as Margaret sat in her RV reviewing Maya's suggestions for her next piece, her phone lit up with a notification. The pink-haired girl's post of her painting had gone viral in the local art community. Comments poured in. "This is what courage looks like. Started crying in public thanks. Is she really 70 and just starting? Where can we see more?" The last comment caught her eye. "Starting an art career at 70? Goals F. Career," the word, hit her like a physical force. She'd always thought of art as something she'd missed her chance at, like a train long departed. But sitting there, paint still under her fingernails, her body tired but her mind alive with possibilities, she realized maybe the train hadn't left. Maybe she'd just been standing on the wrong platform. Her phone rang. Emma, of course. Probably calling about the photo of the painting Tommy had undoubtedly shown her. But for the first time in her life, Margaret didn't feel the need to explain herself. She had 6 months left, and not a single minute to waste on justifying her choices. Instead of answering, she pulled out her sketchbook and began planning her next piece. This one would be about time. Not the time she'd lost, but the time she still had. And she would paint it in colors so bright they would burn through every beige wall she'd ever hidden behind. The Oregon coast materialized through the morning mist like a watercolor painting coming into focus. Margaret gripped the RV's steering wheel tighter, Joe's voice echoing in her head. "Trust your instincts." She'd been driving for 4 days, each mile taking her further from her old life and closer to the sister she hadn't seen in 20 years. Claire's art commune turned out to be more sophisticated than Margaret had imagined. A cluster of modern buildings nestled against the coastline, their walls covered in murals. A sign read, "Pacific Arts Collective, where creativity meets community." She parked the RV, her heart pounding. The cancer medication sat heavy in her pocket, a reminder that this wasn't just a journey of reconciliation, but a race against time. "Can I help you?" A young woman with salt-crusted hair approached, carrying a clay pot. "I'm looking for Claire." "Bennett. Oh, you're here for a reading. Claire's poetry workshop is full this week, but poetry?" Margaret couldn't help but laugh. Her wild painter sister had become a poet. "I'm her sister," she added, watching the woman's eyes widen in recognition. "You're Margaret? The one in the painting?" Before Margaret could ask what painting, a familiar voice cut through the misty air. "Mags?" Claire stood at the top of a small hill, her dark hair now streaked with silver, but her stance exactly as Margaret remembered. Slightly defiant, ready to either fight or embrace life, whichever came first. For a moment neither sister moved. 20 years of silence stretched between them like a chasm. Then Claire spoke again, her voice softer. "You look like Mom. You look like you." Margaret replied, and somehow that broke the tension. Claire laughed, the same wild laugh from their childhood, and suddenly they were hugging, both crying and trying to pretend they weren't. "Come see something," Claire said when they finally separated. She led Margaret to a small gallery space, attached to the main building. There, taking up an entire wall, was a massive painting, two young girls on a beach, their dark hair blowing in the wind, holding hands and facing an endless horizon. "You kept painting us," Margaret whispered. "Someone had to remember who we were." Claire's voice held no accusation, just a deep sadness. "Why are you here, Mags?" "I'm dying." The words came easier now with practice. "Pancreatic cancer. 6 months, give or take." Claire's sharp intake of breath was followed by a string of creative curses that almost made Margaret smile. "Same old Claire. And you're here because I should have come 20 years ago, because you were right, about Dad's will, about art, about living, because I'm done being afraid." They sat in Claire's studio as Margaret explained everything. The diagnosis, the refused treatment, the RV, the art classes. Claire listened in silence, absently moulding a piece of clay between her fingers. "I inherited Dad's spine, after all," Margaret finished. "Just took me 70 years to find it." "You inherited his timing too," Claire said dryly. "Always late, but making an entrance when you finally show up." She stood, walking to a shelf filled with sketchbooks. "I have something for you. Been saving it, though I'm not sure why." She handed Margaret a worn envelope. Inside was the check their father had left Margaret in his will, the one she'd torn up during their final fight, when Claire had accused her of being their father's favorite, of always playing it safe while Claire took the risks. "I taped it back together," Claire said quietly. "Kept meaning to mail it, but pride's a stubborn thing in our family." "Keep it," Margaret said. "Use it for the commune." That's what Dad would have wanted, his money going to actual art, not safety deposit boxes. Claire studied her for a long moment. "You really are dying, aren't you?" The old Margaret would never say that. The old Margaret died in a doctor's office 2 weeks ago. "I'm just finally living." That evening they sat on the beach, sharing a bottle of wine and 2 decades of stories. Claire had become a renowned sculpture artist, her work featured in galleries across the country. She'd been married twice, written 3 books of poetry, and started the commune as a haven for artists who, like her, never fit into conventional spaces. "What will you do now?" Claire asked as the sun set over the Pacific. Margaret pulled out her sketchbook, showing Claire her living list. Her sister read it, then added an item in her bold handwriting. "Paint with your sister one last time." "Tomorrow," Claire said firmly. "We'll set up on the beach. I want to see if you've still got it." That night in her RV, Margaret wrote in her journal, "Found Claire, found myself, found out it's never too late for either." The pain in her side was worse, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. Tomorrow she would paint with her sister. Tomorrow she would start making up for lost time. Tomorrow was no longer something to wait for. It was something to seize. The Chicago Gallery District buzzed with Friday night energy as Margaret made her way down Superior Street, her portfolio clutched tightly against her chest. After a week in Oregon with Claire, she'd returned home with renewed purpose and a collection of new works. Seascapes, portraits, and the centerpiece, a massive canvas she and Claire had painted together, their styles merging and diverging like the waves they'd captured. The Webster Gallery was smaller than the others, tucked between a wine bar and a boutique. Through the window, Margaret could see a young woman rearranging sculptures on pristine pedestals. The sign on the door read, "Emerging Artists Welcome, Portfolio Reviews every Friday." "Emerging at 70, Margaret muttered to herself, reaching for the door handle. A wave of pain made her pause, reminding her why she couldn't afford to hesitate. She pushed through. "I'm sorry, but portfolio reviews ended at 6, the young woman said without looking up from her arrangement. "Then I suppose it's good I'm not here for a review." Margaret channeled Claire's fearless energy. "I'm here to show you what the art world's been missing for 50 years. That got her attention. The woman, Alex Webster, according to her name. Tag, turned, her expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity as she took in Margaret's paint-stained hands and determined stance. "You're her," Alex said suddenly. "The viral grandmother artist, the one from Maya's class." Margaret hadn't expected this. Her self-portrait had apparently travelled further than she'd thought. "Show me," Alex said, gesturing to a small viewing room. One by one, Margaret laid out her pieces. The self-portrait that had gone viral, the seascapes from Oregon, studies of Claire's commune, and finally the massive sister piece. Alex was silent for a long moment. "How long have you been painting?" 50 years, Margaret said. "And 2 weeks. That makes no sense. Neither does waiting 50 years to live your dream. But here we are." Alex picked up one of the seascapes, studying it closely. "These are incredible. The technique shows decades of observation, but the execution has this raw, urgent energy, like someone who's been holding their breath for years and finally started breathing." She paused. "Why now?" Margaret considered, deflecting, but truth had become her new medium of choice. "Because I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer and 6 months to live. Well, 5 now, and I'm done waiting for someday." Alex nearly dropped the painting. I'm so sorry." "Don't be. I've never been more alive." What followed was a 2-hour conversation about art, life, death, and legacy. Alex shared her own story of starting the gallery at 25, defying her corporate parents. Margaret shared her journey from safe choices to this final, bold adventure. "I want to give you a show," Alex said finally. "Not because you're dying, though that will certainly add to the narrative, but because these works deserve to be seen. They're about transformation, about the courage to change even when time is running out, especially then." Margaret felt tears threatening but held them back. "My daughter will try to talk you out of it. She'll say I'm having a crisis." "Are you?" "Of course I am. The best kind." Alex grinned. "I'll call it late bloom. Opening night in 3 weeks." As Margaret left the gallery, her phone buzzed. A text from Tommy. "Did you do it? Did you show them?" She smiled, typing back, "Shows in 3 weeks. Want to help me prepare?" His response was immediate. "Epic! Mom's gonna freak." Another wave of pain hit, stronger this time. Margaret leaned against her RV, breathing through it. She hadn't told anyone that the 6 months were looking more like 4, according to her last checkup. But that just meant she needed to work faster, live bolder, paint more. She climbed into the RV, now adorned with Claire's paintings and sketches from Tommy's art classes. On the small table lay her living list. Next to "Show my art in a gallery," she drew a star, then added beneath it, "Show my heart to the world." The sun was setting over Chicago's skyline, painting the city in shades of possibility. Margaret picked up her brush. She had paintings to finish, time to defy, and a legacy to create. The gallery lights would be bright in 3 weeks, and she intended to shine brighter. Tommy stood in Margaret's driveway, his backpack clutched in front of him like a shield, his blue hair catching the morning light. "I want to go with you," he said, his voice carrying that peculiar mix of teenage bravado and uncertainty. "On your next trip, I want to learn how to paint like you do." Margaret set down her paintbrush, wiping her hands on her now perpetually paint-stained apron. She'd been working on pieces for the upcoming show, the RV serving as her mobile studio. "Have you talked to your mother about this?" "Mom's not talking about anything except doctors and lawyers right now." His attempt at a casual shrug couldn't hide the hurt in his voice. "She says you're being selfish." The word hung in the air between them. Selfish. Margaret had heard it a lot lately, in Emma's increasingly angry voicemails, in concerned calls. From old friends, even from her bridge club, who'd sent a group email suggesting a good therapist. "Maybe I am," Margaret said finally. "But do you know what I've learned, Tommy? Sometimes being selfish is actually being honest. Sometimes it's the most unselfish thing you can do." "That makes no sense," Tommy said, but he was smiling slightly. "Neither. Does waiting your whole life to be who you really are?" She studied her grandson's face, so young, yet already showing signs of the same careful restraint she'd worn for decades. Does Emma know you're here? She thinks I'm at coding camp. She signed me up for it. Says art isn't a practical career choice. The bitterness in his voice was painfully familiar. Margaret felt a stab of recognition, sharper than any pain her. Cancer had delivered. History repeating itself. Emma becoming Robert, Tommy becoming her. The same cycle of practical choices over passionate dreams. 1 week, she said suddenly. The coast and back. We'll paint, we'll drive, we'll see what there is to see, but... She held up a hand as Tommy's face lit up. We tell your mother first. The argument, when it came, was spectacular. Have you completely lost your mind? Emma stood in Margaret's kitchen, her professional composure cracking. You're taking my son on a road trip, in your condition, without treatment, with his mother's permission, Margaret corrected calmly. That's why we're having this conversation. There is no conversation. To have. It's not happening. Tommy, get in the car. But Tommy didn't move from his spot beside Margaret. Instead, he pulled out his sketchbook, the one she'd given him, and opened it to a drawing of her. It was good, surprisingly good, capturing not just her appearance, but something of her spirit. Mom, look, he said quietly. Really look. Emma's hands trembled as she took the sketchbook. When did you learn to... Grandma's been teaching me. Every day after school. He took a deep breath. I don't want to be a programmer. I want to be an artist, and I want to learn from her, while I still can. The last words hung heavy in the kitchen. Emma sank into a chair, the sketchbook open in her lap. Tommy, please understand, your grandmother is very sick. She needs medical care, not adventures. No, Margaret said softly. What I need is to give him what I never gave you, permission to choose his own path, by taking him away from his responsibilities, his summer programs, by showing him that responsibility to yourself is just as important as responsibility to others. Margaret reached for her daughter's hand. Emma, look at me. Really look. I'm more alive now than I've been in 40 years. And yes, I'm dying, but I'm finally living first. And what about what I need? Emma's voice cracked. I need my mother to fight, to stay, to not give up. Oh, sweetheart. Margaret pulled her daughter close, feeling how she resisted at first, then melted into the embrace like she had as a child. I'm not giving up. I'm giving over. To life, to art, to truth. And I want to give Tommy something I never gave you, the sight of his grandmother being truly, completely herself. They stayed like that for a long moment, 3 generations in a sunlit kitchen, surrounded by paintings and possibilities. Finally, Emma straightened, wiping her eyes. 1 week, she said firmly. You check in every day. And Tommy, she turned to her son, you take care of her. Actually, Margaret smiled, I think we'll take care of each other. Later, as they packed the RV with art supplies and Tommy's carefully chosen snacks, Margaret felt the familiar pain in her side, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger, the joy of passing on not just her art, but her hard-won wisdom about living true to oneself. Sometimes, she was learning, the greatest gift you can give is the permission to be free. The RV rumbled along the coastline, windows opened to the salty air. Tommy sat in the passenger seat, sketching the changing landscape with quick, confident strokes that reminded Margaret of Claire's early work. They'd been on the road for 3 days, and already she could see him changing, his posture looser, his smile coming easier, his art growing bolder with each attempt. You're not drawing what you see, Margaret observed as she glanced at his sketch. The coastline on his paper was wilder than the one before them, the waves more dramatic, the sky more alive. I'm drawing what I feel, Tommy replied, not looking up, like you taught me. The pain had been worse this morning, but Margaret hadn't taken her full dose of medication. She needed to stay sharp, to memorize every detail of these moments. They'd stopped at every scenic overlook, set up their easels side by side, and painted together in comfortable silence. Grandma. Tommy's voice pulled her from her thoughts. Why didn't you ever teach Mom to paint? Margaret gripped the steering wheel tighter. I tried once, but your grandfather, he was very persuasive about practical pursuits, and I wasn't strong enough then to fight for what I believed in. Mom's like that too. Everything has to have a purpose, a career path. He added darker shadows to his sketch. She found my college research yesterday. Art schools, she wasn't happy. And what did you say? I showed her your gallery invitation. Told her that Alex Webster is one of the most respected young curators in Chicago, that she's already talking about a touring exhibition of your work. He grinned. Used lots of business terms, marketing potential, career trajectory, spoke her language. Margaret laughed, then coughed. Tommy pretended not to notice. How she wiped her mouth afterward, just as he pretended not to see her taking her pills each morning. They had an unspoken agreement about such things. They pulled over at a small beach town for lunch. Tommy insisted on carrying their art supplies, setting up their easels facing the pier. As they painted, a small crowd gathered to watch. The 70-year-old woman and the blue-haired teenager working side by side, their styles distinctly different, yet somehow harmonious. Your lines are getting stronger, Margaret noted, studying Tommy's work. You're not apologizing with your brush anymore. What do you mean? Look here. She pointed to his earlier sketches. You used to make tentative strokes, like you were asking permission to take up space on the paper. Now you're claiming it. That's good. Art isn't about permission, it's about declaration. A woman in the crowd asked if she could take their picture. Soon they were sharing their story, grandmother and grandson, both finding their art late but fearlessly. Tommy handled the social media posts, something about intergenerational artistic awakening and never too late to start living. That evening, parked by the beach, they sat in the RV looking through their day's work. Tommy had captured the essence of every place they'd stopped, his style evolving with each piece. Margaret felt simultaneously exhausted and exhilarated. I get it now, Tommy said suddenly. Why you're doing all this. It's not just about the art, is it? What do you think it's about? He looked down at his sketchbook, then back at her. It's about being brave enough to be yourself before it's too late. About showing people it's okay to change, to want different, and things than what everyone expects. Margaret felt tears welling up but blinked them back. When did you get so wise? Must be all the sea air. He grinned, then grew serious. I'm going to apply to art school, even if Mom freaks out, even if I have to figure out scholarships and stuff on my own. You won't be on your own, Margaret said firmly. I've been making some arrangements. The paintings from the gallery show, well, Alex thinks they'll sell well. I've set up a trust. For your education, for whatever kind of education you choose. Grandma, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Because this trip isn't just about making memories, Tommy. It's about making sure that when I'm gone, you'll have what you need to keep being brave. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set over the ocean. Tommy eventually fell asleep on the converted bed, his sketchbook still open beside him. Margaret watched him for a while, seeing in his peaceful face both the child he'd been and the artist he was becoming. She took out her journal, adding to her living list, "Show Tommy how to live without fear." Then beneath it, "Mission accomplished." The gallery preparation was in full swing when it happened. Margaret had been hanging her centerpiece, the massive sister painting from Oregon, when the pain struck, sharper than ever before. She stumbled, the room spinning, and knocked over a tray of painting supplies. Tommy, who'd been helping after school, rushed to catch her before she fell. "Your pills," he said, reaching for her bag. "Where are—" He stopped, staring at the bottle he'd just pulled out. Not pain medication, but morphine. Strong doses. His face went pale as he read the label, understanding dawning in his eyes. "How bad is it really?" he whispered. "How long?" Before Margaret could answer, Emma's voice cut through the gallery. "Tommy, the school called. You missed coding class again?" She stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene, her son holding the morphine bottle, her mother leaning heavily against the wall, paint supplies scattered across the floor. "What's Going on? Emma's lawyer voice took over, sharp and demanding. Show her, Tommy said quietly to Margaret. Show her everything. With trembling hands, Margaret reached into her bag and pulled out her medical file. She'd been carrying it with her, knowing this moment would come eventually. Emma snatched it, flipping through pages with increasing agitation. 4 to 6 weeks, her voice cracked. The original prognosis was 6 months. When did this change? Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have forced me into treatment. Of course I would have. You're dying faster than you need to, and for what? Art? A road trip? These ridiculous paintings? Mum, Tommy tried to intervene, but Emma was beyond hearing. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family? To Tommy, teaching him it's okay to run away from reality, to choose dreams over responsibility, like I taught you. Margaret's quiet words cut through Emma's tirade. Like I showed you by example that being practical was more important than being true to yourself? The gallery fell silent. Even Alex, who'd been hovering uncertainly in the doorway, stepped out to give them privacy. I've had 2 lives, Emma, Margaret continued, easing herself onto a nearby chair. The first one lasted 70 years. I spent it being sensible, being proper, being afraid. This is my second life. It's shorter, but it's real. It's selfish, Emma whispered, but the anger had drained from her voice. Yes, Margaret agreed. Like breathing is selfish. Like your father and I were selfish, teaching you that security matters more than passion. Teaching you so well that now you're doing the same to Tommy. Emma looked at her son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time seeing not the child she was trying to protect, but the young artist emerging. Tommy stood straighter under her gaze, his hand still gripping the morphine bottle. The paintings, he said suddenly. Look at them, Mom. Really look. Emma turned slowly, taking in the gallery walls. Margaret's journey hung before them, the self-portrait of emergence, the seascapes with Claire, the studies of Tommy painting. But it was the latest series that caught Emma's eye. Paintings of her done from old photographs. Emma as a toddler with a paintbrush. Emma at 7, drawing on the sidewalk. Emma at 12, sketching in a notebook. And finally, Emma now, in her lawyer's suit, looking at her phone, a forgotten sketchbook visible on her desk. You kept them, Emma said softly. All my old drawings, in the same box as my art supplies. Everything we both gave up. Emma sank down beside her mother, the medical file falling from her hands. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. How to watch you choose to leave us sooner than... I'm not leaving. Margaret took her daughter's hand. I'm showing you both how to live. It's the only gift I have left to give, and I don't have time to waste. The gallery opening, Tommy said. It's in 2 weeks. Will you... I'll be there, Margaret said firmly. I have morphine for the pain, art for the soul, and the 2 of you for strength. I'll be there. They sat together in the gallery, surrounded by paintings that told the story of 3 generations, one finding her voice too late, one who lost it along the way, and one just beginning to speak his truth through color and light. Help me hang. The rest, Margaret finally said, and then I'll tell you everything, all the things I should have said years ago, all the things you both need to know. As they worked, Margaret felt the pain in her side, counting the weeks in her mind. But for the first time since her diagnosis, she saw Emma looking at the paintings with more than just worry in her eyes. She saw her daughter remembering the artist she'd once wanted to be. Sometimes, Margaret realized, the hardest truth to tell is the one that sets everyone free. The next few days unleashed a whirlwind. Emma, unable to completely let go of control, had mobilized an army of specialists for second opinions. Their verdict remained unchanged, 4 to 6 weeks. Each confirmation felt like another nail being driven into the family's hope, but Margaret remained serene in the storm of activity around her. I won't spend my last weeks in consultation rooms, she told Emma firmly one morning as they sat in her RV-turned-studio. The gallery opening is in 10 days. That's where my energy needs to go. The gallery opening is exactly why you need to consider emergency treatment. Emma argued, spreading medical papers across Margaret's paint-splattered table. There are experimental trials, which would make me too sick to finish my work. Margaret picked up a brush, adding highlights to her latest piece, a painting of Emma as a child, flying a kite against a summer sky. Look at what I'm doing. Now, Emma, really look. But Emma was already reaching for her phone, which had been buzzing consistently since Claire's arrival in Chicago. Margaret's sister had come roaring in from Oregon like a hurricane, bringing with her a fierce protectiveness that both clashed with and complemented Emma's methodical approach to crisis. Your aunt's meeting with another holistic specialist, Emma said, scanning her messages. Something about alternative therapies. Stop! Margaret's quiet command cut through the chaos. Both of you, please. The pain had been worse that morning. But Margaret had found that painting helped, not by distracting from it, but by transforming it into something else, something meaningful. Each brushstroke felt like time captured, preserved. Tommy arrived after school, his own art supplies in hand. He'd been quieter since the revelation about the shortened timeline, but his dedication to art had only intensified. He set up his easel. Beside Margaret's working on his piece for the upcoming show, Alex had insisted on including his work alongside his grandmother's. Your Instagram following hit 50,000, he mentioned casually, mixing colors with growing confidence. People are calling you the terminal artist. Kind of dramatic. Everything's dramatic at 70, Margaret smiled. Especially living. The media had indeed caught wind of the story. Local news wanted interviews, art blogs were writing features, and Alex's phone rang constantly with inquiries about the upcoming show. The narrative had captured something in the public imagination, the dying artist finding her voice, the grandmother inspiring her grandson, the family healing through art. Claire burst in, her silver-streaked hair wild from the wind. The holistic. Doctor was a bust, she announced, but I've got something better. The Chicago Arts Foundation wants to talk about a grant, a legacy program in your name, Mags, for older artists just starting their journey. Margaret watched emotions war on Emma's face, pride fighting with pain, hope battling grief. Her daughter had been trying so hard to fix everything, to find solutions, to maintain control, just like Margaret had taught her to do. Sit down, Margaret patted the spot beside her. Both of you, take a brush. Mom, I haven't painted since I taught you it wasn't practical, I know, but we're out of time for practical. Slowly, hesitantly, Emma sat. Claire took up position on Margaret's other side, while Tommy continued working on his own canvas, pretending not to watch the adults intently. Paint what you're feeling, Margaret instructed, handing them each a palette. Not what you think. You should feel. Not what you wish you felt. What's real right now. For hours they painted together. Emma's strokes started stiff, controlled, but gradually loosened as emotion overtook technique. Claire's wild energy found focus in her grief and love. Tommy captured them all in quick, sensitive sketches. And Margaret, moving between them, guided and encouraged and memorized every moment. The storm still raged outside their bubble. Doctors called, journalists emailed, time ticked away. But in the RV, surrounded by art and family, Margaret felt nothing but peace. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The show will be ready, she said finally, looking at their collected work. And so, will we? Emma wiped paint-stained hands on her expensive skirt, not even seeming to notice. Promise me something? Anything. Promise you'll haunt my office if I ever try to talk Tommy out of art school. For the first time since the truth had come out, they all laughed. The sound rang through the RV like music, like hope, like the beginning of acceptance. Outside, Chicago's skyline caught the setting sun, turning the city into a canvas of possibility. Margaret added another stroke to her painting, capturing that light. She had 10 days until the show. 10 days to finish her work, both on canvas and in the hearts of her family. The pain would get worse. The The storm would keep raging, but Margaret had finally learned that some storms come not to destroy, but to clear the way for something new to grow. The Webster Gallery hummed with pre-opening energy. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, a concession to the growing weakness in her legs, directing the placement of her final pieces. The morphine helped with the pain, but it couldn't touch the urgency she felt. 3 days until opening night. Every minute mattered. The lighting needs to be warmer on the sister series, she called out to Alex, who was orchestrating the installation like a conductor. The shadows are too harsh. It makes the reconciliation feel unfinished. The Chicago Tribune reviewer is here, Emma whispered, leaning down beside her mother's chair. She'd taken a leave of absence from her law firm, surprising everyone by becoming an efficient and passionate advocate for the show. Are you sure you want to do the interview today? Margaret nodded, watching Tommy adjust the frame of his centerpiece, a portrait of 3 generations of hands, his own holding a brush, Emma's holding a law book, and Margaret's releasing a painted bird into flight. The piece had already been featured in several art blogs, marked as the work of a profound, emerging talent. Ms. Wilson? The reviewer approached, notebook in hand. I have to ask, why wait so long to start? And why reveal your work now? Knowing I won't be here to see where it leads? Margaret finished. The morphine made her thoughts slightly fuzzy, but her voice remained clear. Perhaps that's exactly why. When you have all the time in the world, it's easy to wait for the perfect moment. When you have weeks, you realize that this moment, right now, is the only one that matters. The interview continued as final preparations swirled around them. Margaret watched Claire directing the catering setup, her sister's energy undimmed, despite having slept in a chair by Margaret's bed for the past week. Every few minutes, Claire would glance over, checking, ensuring her sister was still strong enough for all this. Your story has really resonated with people, the reviewer noted, scrolling through his phone. The hashtag #It'sNeverTooLate has thousands of posts, people sharing their own delayed dreams, starting new ventures, returning to abandoned passions. Margaret hadn't known this. She'd left the social media aspects to Tommy, focusing instead on finishing her work while she still could. Show me, she asked. The reviewer held out his phone. Post after post filled the screen. Starting dance classes at 65. It's never too late. Quit my corporate job to write my novel. It's never too late. Teaching my grandma to use Instagram so she can share her poetry. It's never too late. Tears blurred Margaret's vision. Alex appeared at her side with a glass of water and a concerned look. We can finish the interview later. No, Margaret straightened in her chair. People need to hear this, need to understand. She turned back to the reviewer. All my life I thought art was about creating something that lasts. Now I understand it's about creating something that lives. Every painting here is alive, with memory, with hope, with the courage to change. Even after I'm gone, they'll keep speaking, keep encouraging others to listen to that voice inside them that says, now, do it now. The pain surged again, and Emma, ever watchful, noticed her mother's hands trembling. That's enough for today, she said firmly, but with a gentleness that reminded Margaret of Robert. As the reviewer left, Tommy wheeled his grandmother around the gallery, stopping at each piece. They'd arranged the works chronologically, from the self-portrait that started it all, through the Oregon series to the final family pieces. It told the story not just of Margaret's journey, but of a family's transformation. The RSVPs for opening night are overwhelming, Alex reported, checking her tablet. Art critics, collectors, local media, even a documentary crew wants to film. Margaret barely heard her. She was looking at a small painting in the corner, one she'd done just days ago. It showed her RV parked by the ocean, but as a ghost image transparent against the sunset. In the foreground, Tommy sat with his easel. Emma stood with a paintbrush instead of a phone, and Claire danced in the waves. It was a future she wouldn't see, but one she'd helped create. "It's time to rest," Emma said softly. "Save your strength for opening night." As they wheeled her toward the exit, Margaret caught a glimpse of herself in the gallery's windows. Even with the illness evident in her face, she looked more alive than she had in the decades of careful existence before. The woman in the reflection wasn't just dying, she was blazing, lighting a path for others to follow. 3 days, she whispered to herself. 3 days to show the world that it's never too late to become yourself. Opening night at the Webster Gallery transformed the quiet space into a buzzing hub of energy. People packed the rooms, spilling onto the sidewalk outside. Margaret's wheelchair had been positioned strategically near her centerpiece, allowing her to greet visitors while conserving her strength. The morphine dose had been carefully timed, enough to manage the pain, not enough to dull her mind on this crucial evening. "They're not just here for the art," Claire whispered, bent down beside her sister's chair. "They're here for the permission you've given them." She was right. Among the usual gallery crowd, critics, collectors, artists, there were others. An elderly man clutching a dusty violin case. A middle-aged woman with a notebook labeled "My Novel, Draft 1." A teenager who looked remarkably like Tommy, right down to the nervous energy and paint-stained fingers. "Miss Wilson," the teenager approached, her hands twisting together. "Your grandson's been sharing your story online. I showed my dad your paintings and—" She gestured to an older man who stepped forward, carrying a camera with professional confidence. "I used to dream of being a photographer," he said quietly. "Got my first camera at 12, but then life happened, responsibilities. I packed it away 20 years ago." He smiled at his daughter. "We're taking a photography course together now, starting next week." Throughout the evening, similar stories poured in. A retired teacher who'd signed up for dance classes, a businessman who'd finally enrolled in cooking school, a grandmother who'd started a blog about urban gardening. Each one credited Margaret's story with giving them the final push they needed. Tommy managed the social media coverage like a seasoned professional, documenting each interaction, each story of transformation. The hashtag "It's Never Too Late" trended. Locally, then nationally, news crews captured the gallery's electric atmosphere, broadcasting it across the city. "Look at this," Emma said, showing her mother her phone. A video was going viral. Margaret's interview with the Tribune reporter, edited together with images of her work. The comments section overflowed with responses. "Started painting again after 30 years. Thank you for showing me the way." "Calling my estranged sister tonight. No more wasted time. Taking my grandfather to his first writing workshop tomorrow. It's time." Alex darted through the crowd, practically vibrating with excitement. "The Chicago Arts Foundation is here. They want to announce the Margaret Wilson Fellowship for Late-Blooming Artists tonight. 5 full scholarships for artists over 60. Margaret felt tears threatening, but held them back. She needed to stay clear, to witness every moment of this unexpected miracle. Her art hung on the walls, yes, but the real exhibition was happening. In the hearts of those around her, Emma knelt beside her mother's chair, her lawyer's composure softened by wonder. "I found my old sketchbooks last night," she admitted. "Stayed up until 3 just drawing. It felt like remembering how to breathe." Before Margaret could respond, a commotion at the gallery entrance drew their attention. A group of elderly men and women entered, some with walkers, some in wheelchairs, all carrying art supplies. "The Thursday Bridge Club," Margaret whispered, recognizing her former companions. The same women who'd suggested therapy when she'd started her journey were now here, clutching paintbrushes and sketching pencils like talismans. "You showed us it wasn't too late," her old friend Dorothy announced, her voice wavering but determined. "We've started our own art circle, meeting twice a week, no more bridge." The laughter and tears that followed were interrupted by Tommy's voice over the gallery's speaker system. "If I could have everyone's attention, there's something you all need to see." The crowd parted as Tommy and Claire wheeled in a large canvas, still partially covered. Margaret recognized it, her final piece, completed just hours before, when the pain had been worst but her vision clearest. "My grandmother called this one Permission," Tommy announced, his voice strong and sure. "She wanted to save it for tonight, for all of you." The covering fell away. The painting showed a door, massive and ancient, covered in locks, but the locks were breaking, falling away, revealing glimpses of vivid colors beyond. In the foreground, a line of people of all ages reached for keys that rained down like stars. Each key bore a single word, now. The gallery fell silent, then erupted in applause and tears. Margaret sat in her wheelchair, her family gathered around her, watching as her private revolution became a public awakening. She'd given them something that no one else had. Permission to begin, permission to change, permission to ignore the voice that whispers, "Too late." The pain was there, constant now, but it didn't matter. She'd done what she set out to do. She'd shown them all that the time to live, to create, to become was always, always now. The gallery had emptied hours ago, but the Wilson family remained. Margaret's wheelchair had been moved near the window, where the city lights painted patterns across her lap. The pain was worse tonight, but it didn't matter. The triumph in her eyes outshone everything else. "Every piece sold," Alex announced, still sounding amazed. "The waiting list for commissions is over 50 people long. The art world hasn't seen anything like this in years." "They're not buying paintings," Claire observed from her perch on a nearby sculpture pedestal. "They're buying courage." Emma sat cross-legged on the floor beside her mother's wheelchair, something she hadn't done since childhood. Her suit was wrinkled, her professional armor finally cracked. In her hands, she held her old sketchbook, the one Margaret had kept all these years. "I've been so angry," Emma said quietly, turning pages filled with childhood drawings. "Not just about your decision to refuse treatment. About everything, about you teaching me to be practical when you had all this art inside you. About Dad always steering me toward law school when he saw me drawing. About becoming exactly the kind of parent I used to resent." Margaret reached for her daughter's hand, her own trembling slightly. "I taught you what I thought was love. Keeping. You safe, secure. I didn't realize I was teaching you to hide." Tommy, who had been photographing the empty gallery, came to sit with them. His latest piece had sold for nearly as much as some of Margaret's. "An investment in an emerging talent," the collector had said. "Mom found my art school applications," he said. "The ones I tried to hide." Emma nodded, wiping tears. "NYU, RISD, School of the Art Institute of Chicago." She laughed softly. "The same one you got into, Mom. The one you turned down." "And?" Margaret held her breath. "And I called their admissions offices tonight. Asked about early portfolio. Reviews. Tommy's work from the show. They want to see more." The joy that burst through Margaret's pain was almost blinding. She watched as Emma pulled out her phone, showing Tommy the websites she'd already bookmarked. Art schools, scholarship opportunities, summer programs. "I can't promise I won't worry," Emma admitted, "but I promise I won't stand in the way. Not of art, not of dreams, not of truth." Claire sniffled loudly, not bothering to hide her tears. "About time, baby sister." "I've set up the trust fund," Emma continued, her lawyer skills now turned to supporting her son's dreams. "The gallery sales, the commissions, the speaking fees. People are offering. It's more than enough for art school. For any school." "Speaking fees?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You've started a movement, Mom. People want to hear your story. And since you can't—" Emma hesitated, then straightened her shoulders. "I thought maybe I could. Tell your story, I mean. And mine. About how it's never too late to fix what's broken between mothers and daughters, between people and their dreams." Margaret felt a different kind of pain then, the sweet ache of witnessing a transformation. Her daughter, who had spent so long building walls, was now building bridges. "There's something else," Emma said, pulling a large package from behind, a nearby sculpture. "I've been working on it all week between gallery preparations." The paper fell away, revealing a painting, Emma's first in decades. It showed three women, Margaret, Emma, and Emma's grandmother, all at the same age, all holding paintbrushes. Below it, in careful letters, "The legacy lives." "It's not very good," Emma said quickly. "I'm out of practice." "It's perfect," Margaret whispered, "because it's true." They sat together in the gallery, surrounded by Margaret's art, her last gift to the world, her declaration of independence, her permission slip for others to do the same. The pain was constant now, but so was the joy. Tommy started humming. As he sketched the scene, his mother and grandmother finally seeing each other clearly. Claire joined in, her voice carrying the folk songs they'd sung as girls, and Emma, still holding her mother's hand, began to talk about colour theory and light, remembering lessons learned long ago. "I think," Margaret said softly, "this is what peace feels like." Outside, Chicago continued its nighttime dance of lights and shadows. Inside, in a gallery filled with truth and reconciliation, a family healed, not by forgetting the past, but by painting a new future together. 2 weeks after the gallery opening, Margaret's RV was parked at the lakefront, its door open to the early morning breeze. She lay in the converted bed, surrounded by art supplies, sketchbooks, and family. The morphine drip kept the pain at bay, but everyone knew these were her final days. The Margaret Wilson Fellowship had already announced its first recipients, 5 artists over 60, each with a story of deferred dreams. They would begin their artistic journeys next month, their tuition fully covered, their courage borrowed from the woman who had shown them the way. "The Today Show wants to do a feature," Tommy reported, sitting cross-legged beside his grandmother's bed, "about the fellowship, about everything." "Make sure they get it right," Margaret whispered. "It's not about me. It's about permission." Emma had taken over the fellowship's organization, channeling her legal expertise into creating opportunities for other late-blooming artists. She sat nearby, sketching the lake view, her newly purchased art supplies never far from reach. Throughout the day, visitors came to the RV, artists from the gallery opening, members of the former Bridge Club, now an art collective, even Dr. Harrison, who admitted that Margaret's choice had taught him something about quality of life versus quantity. Claire maintained a constant presence, her fierce protectiveness now softened into gentle care. She read aloud from Margaret's journal, remembering their shared childhood dreams, celebrating the ones they'd finally fulfilled. The Chicago Art Institute had offered Tommy early admission to their summer program. His portfolio, including his pieces from the gallery show, had impressed the admissions committee. "They said my work shows unusual emotional depth," he told. Margaret, his eyes shining, "that I paint like I've lived several lifetimes." "You have," Margaret smiled. "You've lived mine too." Late in the afternoon, as the sun painted the lake in colors Margaret had spent her life longing to capture, she asked for her final canvas. Her hands shook too much to hold a brush, but she could still direct. "Tommy, you'll be my hands," she said. "Emma, you'll be my heart. Claire, you'll be my memory." Together, they created her last painting. Tommy held the brush, following her instructions. Emma chose the colors, finally trusting her artistic instincts. Claire provided stories and laughter, keeping Margaret's spirit strong as her body weakened. The resulting piece showed a door standing open to a sunrise. Through it, viewers could see an easel waiting, brushes ready, canvas blank with possibility. At the bottom, in script that combined Tommy's technique with Margaret's vision, were the words, "Now is always the perfect time to begin." "The foundation is set up," Emma reported, her lawyer self making one final appearance. "Every sale from the gallery show, every future commission, every speaking fee, it all goes to helping others find their voice." "There now," Margaret nodded, her eyes growing heavy. The pain was distant now, replaced by a profound sense of completion. She had done what she set out to do. More than that, she had become who she was always meant to be. "Promise me," she said softly, looking at each of them in turn. "Promise me you'll keep painting, keep creating, keep becoming." "We promise," They answered in unison, and in their voices she heard the future, a future where art and truth and courage would ripple outward, touching life after life, dream after dream. Outside, the sun set over Lake Michigan, creating the kind of sky Margaret had always longed to paint. Inside the RV, surrounded by love and art and possibility, she smiled at her final masterpiece, not the painting before her, but the lives she had helped transform. The sunrise painted Lake Michigan in shades of gold and promise. Margaret lay in her RV bed, her breathing shallow but peaceful. Emma sat on one side, Claire on the other, while Tommy worked at his easel by the window, capturing the dawn. "The light," Margaret whispered, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you see how it catches the waves, like thousands of tiny brush strokes?" "I see it, Mom," Emma said softly, her own sketchbook open in her lap. "I'll never stop seeing it now." Claire held up a small canvas, Margaret's first painting from childhood, preserved all these years. In it, two girls stood facing a sunrise, their futures as bright as the coming day. "You always could capture hope," she said, her voice thick with tears. Margaret smiled, watching Tommy mix colors with confident strokes. He was using her techniques, but his style was all his own. Bold, fearless, true. On his canvas, the sunrise became something more than light and water. It became possibility. "Perfect," Margaret breathed, as her grandson added the final touch. A small figure standing at the edge of his painted lake, paintbrush raised to the sky. In her final moment, Margaret saw not darkness but color, every shade she'd ever loved, every hue she'd taught Tommy to mix, every tint of courage she'd helped others find. Her last breath was peaceful, carrying with it the knowledge that her greatest work would live on in the hearts and hands of those she'd taught to be brave. 1 year later, the Webster Gallery was packed again. Tommy stood before his first solo exhibition, his blue hair now streaked with gold, his confidence evident in every gesture as he explained his work to admirers. The show was titled Legacy, and each piece told part of his grandmother's story. Emma, wearing paint-stained jeans under her blazer, moved through the crowd with easy grace. She'd become the voice of the Margaret Wilson Foundation, traveling the country to share their story and help others find their delayed dreams. Her own artwork, though still developing, now filled her office walls. Claire had expanded the Pacific Arts Collective to include a residency program for senior artists, inspired by her sister's journey. The first group of Margaret Wilson Fellows had completed their program, each one launching their own artistic careers in their 60s and 70s. On the gallery's main wall hung Margaret's final painting, The Open Door to Sunrise, now surrounded by photographs of lives she'd helped transform, the violin player performing his first concert, the novelist holding her published book, the father and daughter showcasing their photography exhibition. The hashtag, "It's Never Too Late," had become a global movement, inspiring thousands to embrace their dormant dreams. But here in Chicago, in a gallery where it all began, her greatest masterpiece lived on in the hearts of a family that had learned to paint their lives in colors of truth and courage. "Time to begin," Tommy whispered to the sky, echoing his grandmother's words as he picked up his brush, ready to create his own legacy.